wasn't just a photograph of a boy. It was a secret, a lost name, and an old wound no one had dared to look at. When that smiling face began to peer down from the mantelpiece, no one imagined it would lead to someone's death. But when Miss Marple looked into those eyes, she knew. Someone had come back, not just to be remembered, but perhaps to take revenge. The train from Paddington had arrived with its usual punctuality, depositing Miss Marple at the quiet little station that served the villages nestled between East Downs and Much Benham. The summer hedges were brimming with late roses and honeysuckle. The air was heavy with the perfume of elderflower, and the spire of St. Oldhelm's Church appeared, as always, to watch over the lane, like an old vicar surveying a drowsy congregation. It wasn't the first time Miss Marple had attended a gathering of the St. Oldhelm's Women's Guild. In her quietly methodical way, she made a point of visiting neighboring parishes under the noble guise of fellowship and charitable unity, though the true benefit lay in hearing the gossip of communities not her own, unfiltered, honest, and often revealing. On this particular occasion, however, the atmosphere at the church hall was less embroidered with cheer than usual. Conversations faltered, teacups rattled more than necessary, and heads tilted together over plates of seed cake, in a posture more suited to inquiry than celebration. Colonel Grenfell had died only a month before. Suddenly, it was said, of heart failure, and though there had been no suggestion of impropriety, there was something distinctly unfinished in the way villagers referred to the event. He had not been beloved, but nor had he been disliked. He had simply been one of those immovable Englishmen, pocket watch, stern mustache, punctual as frost. Now he was gone, and the village had begun to speculate on what remained in his place. Later that afternoon, in the subdued comfort of Mrs. Grenfell's parlor, Miss Marple partook of a second cup of tea, lukewarm, delicately overbrewed, and allowed her eyes to wander, as they often did. The room bore the marks of restrained good taste: brass fireplace tools, Staffordshire figurines upon the mantel, and floral drapery that might have been purchased at Harrods during the more prosperous years of empire. Everything was in its place, except one thing. Among the usual arrangement of silver-framed photographs, wedding portraits, regimental groups, and one dog of uncertain breed, there now stood a small, modern frame of polished walnut. The subject was a boy, no more than 10, dressed in a sailor suit some decades out of fashion. His features were open, almost cheerful, but there was something disquieting in his expression, perhaps in the eyes, which seemed too still, too patient. The photograph did not belong. Miss Marple, with her gentle countenance and knotted hands, remarked nothing at first. She simply noted its position, centered, as though meant to be noticed. And yet, curiously, no one did. Mrs. Grenfell had made no mention of it during her long account of the post-funeral arrangements, nor did the other guests acknowledge the image in their polite observations. It stood there silently, like a misplaced memory, neither recent nor entirely distant. Miss Marple sipped her tea once more, her thoughts quietly aligning themselves. The boy was not a Grenfell, not of the regiment, nor of the bloodline. Then why was he watching the room, smiling faintly, as though he had been waiting to be remembered? The tea, as expected, drew to a close, not with farewells, but with clusters. Women, many in smart hats, or with gloves folded just so, lingered in threes and fours, their voices low, yet purposeful. A death, even when expected, was a marvelous excuse for rumor, particularly one that came without fuss or scandal. In Colonel Grenfell's case, the lack of drama seemed to invite invention. "Of course she didn't cry, not once," murmured Mrs. Burley, whose judgment of womanhood rested squarely on the presence or absence of tears. "Just stood there with that hard little smile of hers, as if he'd only gone off to the garden." "And the will," said another, Miss Sharp, from the greengrocer's, whose name belied nothing of her tone. "Left it all to her, as if there wasn't a cousin in Wiltshire worth a halfpenny." Some remarked that Mrs. Grenfell had been too calm, others that she had been too distracted. One said she'd seen her in the churchyard long after dusk, just standing there in her gloves, staring at nothing. A young housemaid from across the lane mentioned seeing a light on in the drawing-room, at a most unusual hour. No one mentioned the photograph directly, but all spoke as if something had shifted in the house, since the Colonel's death. Miss Marple, meanwhile, listened. She nodded sympathetically, observed quietly, and tucked each detail away, like a lace handkerchief folded into her handbag. She did not yet know the full shape of the mystery, but she had caught its scent, faint and unmistakable, like lavender left too long in the drawer. It was the kind of inquiry that Miss Marple had long since mastered, casual in tone, faintly self-deprecating, delivered as though it were of no consequence whatsoever. Over a second slice of seed cake, she happened to remark that the child in the new photograph bore a rather continental look about him, perhaps Spanish blood, somewhere, and then, almost as an afterthought, added that she could not recall seeing him at any village fete or school event. Mrs. Weather pursed her lips, her spectacles trembling faintly upon her nose. "Now that you mention it," she said, "I can't place him at all, and I've known all the children in this village since their christenings." Others echoed the sentiment. Miss Jilly, who taught piano and prided herself on remembering every sticky-fingered pupil, looked at the photograph with a mixture of curiosity and faint unease. "No," she murmured, "he's not local. I should have remembered those eyes, rather too clever for his age." The theory that the boy might be a relative, perhaps a nephew from the Colonel's side, was quickly dismissed. He had no siblings, someone whispered, and no nieces. Only Ellen, the wife's side. Miss Marple noted, as she often did, not only what was said, but how it was said, and more importantly, what was not said. There was no affection attached to the boy's image, no familial possessiveness. It was not the absence of memory that concerned her, but the absence of belonging. Something, or someone, was being quietly concealed. Mrs. Grenfell was not a woman easily shaken. Since the Colonel's passing, she had adopted the composed elegance of a portrait widow, neither dramatic nor evasive, but polished, cool, and perhaps too deliberate. When Miss Marple, in her gently faltering voice, ventured to ask whether the photograph on the mantel was a recent addition, Mrs. Grenfell's teacup paused, for half a second, before reaching its saucer. "Oh, that," she said, with a lightness that did not reach her eyes. "A family piece. I found it among some of my late husband's things. Thought it rather charming, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "He has such a direct gaze, that little boy. Quite arresting, really. It made me wonder whether he might have belonged to one of the Indian postings. Colonial families often kept such portraits." Mrs. Grenfell adjusted a brooch at her collar and gave the faintest of shrugs. "I dare say one forgets over time where such things come from." There was, to Miss Marple's ear, something rehearsed in the response, the type of answer given not to inform, but to close a subject gently and permanently. The widow's fingers, elegant, ringless now, lingered on her lap, as though bracing against some inward tremor. She was not afraid of the photo, Miss Marple sensed, but of the questions it invited. And yet, for all her grace and composure, there remained something unresolved in her stillness, the kind of silence not born of mourning, but of memory, a memory one has no wish to revisit. Miss Marple had long believed that the back of a photograph was often more informative than the front. When the last of the tea guests had excused themselves, and Mrs. Grenfell had gone to fetch her gloves, Miss Marple allowed herself the liberty of a closer inspection. Her steps, as ever, were unhurried, her expression mildly absent. One might have thought she was admiring the parlor clock. The frame was of good quality, but new, polished to an unnatural gleam, its corners crisp and unblemished. With a delicate motion, born of years spent mending lace and reading tiny print, Miss Marple tilted the frame and caught a glimpse of its backing. There, beneath the manufacturer's felt, was a faint, time-faded stamp. Dulcote Studio, Bath, 1938. It was a name she remembered. The Dulcote Studio had once been considered rather modern in its day, famed for portraits with softened edges and dramatic lighting. Many families of means from the West Country had patronized the establishment before the war, particularly those who had something to commemorate or conceal. Returning the frame precisely to its position, Miss Marple resumed her seat. Just as Mrs. Grenfell re-entered, the widow offered her a faint smile and suggested they step into the garden for some air. But Miss Marple's thoughts were already elsewhere, moving backwards through time, tracing a path to Bath, to the year 1938, to a boy in a sailor suit, whose eyes had not changed, though every other name around him seemed to have vanished. It was the following Thursday morning when Mrs. Grenfell received a visitor. No appointment had been made, nor letter sent ahead, but the gentleman presented himself with the kind of modest assurance that suggested he was accustomed to being heard, if not necessarily welcomed. Mr. Edwin Channing was a man of neither prominence nor charm, yet he possessed a composure that placed him firmly in the realm of respectable professions, most likely law, or perhaps banking in a quieter county. He introduced himself as a clerk attached to a legal firm in Bath, speaking with a measured voice and precise enunciation. There was nothing showy in his manner, but neither was there diffidence. He stated plainly that he was conducting inquiries into certain genealogical matters, and that he hoped Mrs. Grenfell might be of assistance regarding a family once resident near Larkfield, a village just west of Bath. Mrs. Grenfell, ever the composed widow, received him in the small morning room. She offered a glass of sherry, which he declined, and listened with polite detachment. His papers remained in his case. What he sought was not evidence, it seemed, but recollection, a time, and a name that others might have forgotten, but not, evidently. The name, when it came, was delivered without ceremony. Harold Thursdale, said Mr. Channing. Born illegitimately in 1937, presumed drowned in 1943. There remained discrepancies surrounding the matter. Mrs. Grenfell's expression did not shift, though her hand, resting upon the edge of a doily, stiffened slightly. She responded with a gentle shake of the head, her voice untroubled. I'm afraid the name means nothing to me. Channing did not press her. He simply nodded once, opened a small leather notebook, and asked if she had ever been in service in Somerset prior to her marriage. I spent some time near Bath, yes, she said, but I do not recall a Thursdale family. Miss Marple, who had arrived earlier by invitation for luncheon and was seated inconspicuously in a high-backed chair, observed this exchange with quiet interest. It was not the denial itself that drew her attention, but the timing of it, the pause before the name was disclaimed, the lack of any reciprocal question. Those who are wholly unfamiliar with a name tend to ask why it has been mentioned. The name Thursdale was not merely unfamiliar, it was unwanted, and the air in the room had grown suddenly too still. As the visitor took his leave, Miss Marple's mind traveled gently backward through the corridors of time. The name Thursdale was not unknown to her. On the contrary, it had been whispered, half in scandal and half in pity, amongst the Bath Ladies' Society nearly 3 decades earlier. The Thursleys had been of the old sort, landed, proud, and rigidly private. There had been a daughter, Estelle, whose health had required a year abroad. It was said she returned thinner, but strangely changed. Then there had been the birth, hushed, of course, and swiftly handled. A nursemaid dismissed under questionable circumstances. The child raised quietly, seen only by the most trusted of staff. The family never spoke of him publicly. Rumors, once sparked, scattered like autumn leaves. Some said the boy had been sent to France. Others claimed he died of a fever or drowned near a weir. Miss Marple, who seldom forgot the tenor of a whispered conversation, remembered the phrase, "He was never baptized." Such details clung to memory not because they were shocking, but because they hinted at the unspeakable. And now, a stranger had come to St. Oldhelm's Lane with that name, looking not for the past, but for what had been deliberately erased. Before departing, Mr. Channing allowed himself one brief glance about the room. His gaze moved politely over the furnishings, alighting only momentarily on the items of personal sentiment. Yet when it came to the mantelpiece, his eyes paused. The photograph stood precisely where it had been before, quietly central, almost too deliberately placed. Channing's expression did not alter, but a certain tension stole into his posture. His shoulders, once square, seemed to narrow ever so slightly, as though in recognition or surprise. Miss Marple noticed. She had long learned that reaction is most reliable when it is involuntary. A man may compose his features, train his voice, rehearse his words, but the eyes, when caught unawares, always reveal more than they intend. "It's a striking likeness," Channing murmured, almost to himself. Mrs. Grenfell made no reply. If the photograph was indeed of Harold Thursdale, or of someone who bore resemblance, it was odd that Channing said nothing further. But odd, too, that he did not ask. His silence spoke more keenly than any declaration. He took his leave with proper courtesies. But as the front door closed behind him, Miss Marple's thoughts returned at once to the mantelpiece, and the boy, who now appeared to have two strangers staring back at him. Once the door had closed, Mrs. Grenfell resumed her seat with a calm that might have seemed commendable to a casual guest. But to Miss Marple, whose instincts were sharpened not by suspicion, but by long observation of human frailty, there was something a little too practiced in her composure. She spoke before Miss Marple could pose a question. "An odd young man," she said, with a brittle smile. "He seems to imagine everyone keeps records of forgotten scandals." Miss Marple replied only with a nod, allowing silence to prompt continuation. "I knew no one by that name. Certainly no child. If there was something untoward in Bath in the 30s, I cannot say I paid much attention. I was in service, not society." There was a faint trace of indignation in her voice, not theatrical, but restrained, the kind that comes not from the sting of false accusation, but from the discomfort of half-truths. She poured a fresh cup of tea, her hands now perfectly steady. Miss Marple accepted the cup, but did not drink. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous falsehoods are not lies, but omissions, and Mrs. Grenfell had offered her none, only the polished surface of something deliberately left unsaid. The theft, when discovered the next morning, caused little outward alarm. There had been no broken glass, no forced entry, no mess. Mrs. Grenfell reported the matter to Constable Dove with admirable efficiency, remarking that the front latch might have been left unfastened by the cleaning woman. Nothing else had been disturbed, nothing, that is, save for the photograph. The frame had vanished entirely from the mantel. The space it had occupied now showed the faint ring of displaced dust. The other items, porcelain spaniels, a brass clock, a vase of withering carnations, remained untouched. It was, in every sense, a targeted removal. Constable Dove, a good-natured man of sound shoes and limited imagination, made note of the incident and assured Mrs. Grenfell that no vagrant would want a child's portrait. He suggested it was likely misplaced, or taken by mistake during cleaning. But Miss Marple thought otherwise. The photograph had been recognized, and someone, whether in shame, fear, or protection, had acted to ensure it would no longer be seen. She stood by the empty mantelpiece a moment longer than needed, her fingers lightly touching the absence. Photographs may fade with time, but the truths they conceal, Miss Marple knew, have a habit of resurfacing when one least expects them. It was early morning when word began to pass in that peculiar rural fashion, from milk cart to church porch to grocer's till. A man had been found dead in the lower lane near Great Saffron Gate. No great noise accompanied the news, for the village had learned, in its long centuries of births and burials, to wrap such events in murmurs, not alarms. The man in question was Mr. Edwin Channing, the gentleman from Bath who had paid a brief visit to Mrs. Grenfell only 2 days prior. His body had been discovered by the postman, lying neatly beside the hedgerow, with his briefcase still clasped under one arm and a single boot resting half off his heel. The constable, when summoned, had examined the scene and declared the matter a tragic misstep, perhaps a loose stone or a fainting spell. It had rained during the night, and the lane was slippery. Yet the tidiness of it all gave Miss Marple pause. She had not known Mr. Channing well, barely at all, in fact, but she knew the subtle marks of contrivance when she saw them. Accidents in the countryside were seldom tidy. They were noisy, chaotic, and often left bruises where no bruise should be. She asked 1 or 2 quiet questions and received the expected answers. No one had heard a cry. No one had seen him walking alone, and yet he had been found quite alone, quite still, and far too composed for a man surprised by death. The villagers, as was their way, accepted the constable's verdict with solemn nods and reluctant shrugs. Death, after all, was a familiar companion in these parts, and it rarely called ahead. Yet Miss Marple, in her particular manner, returned to the matter of the walking stick. It was not an item of fashion, but of necessity. Mr. Channing had used it without flourish, habitually, naturally, with his right hand. Miss Marple had observed him leaning on it during his visit to Mrs. Grenfell's, and again as he departed down the gravel path. He held it not like an accessory, but like one who had long relied upon it. The report from the constable, however, described the stick as lying to the left of the body, neatly aligned just outside the fall of his shoulder. That detail, though minor to most, rang discordant to Miss Marple's ear. Those accustomed to using a stick do not abandon it in a fall. They grip it tighter, and if dropped in the act of collapsing, it would not land with such symmetry. Most importantly, it would not have been found on the wrong side, unless placed there. She made no protest to the constable, nor did she raise objection when the death was labeled unfortunate, but not suspicious. She had learned long ago that men in uniform dislike contradiction, but in her mind, a new branch had split from the tree of questions, and this one had roots reaching further than the hedgerow, where poor Mr. Channing had come so suddenly to rest. Inspector Cray arrived from much Benham that same afternoon, with the air of a man resigned to paperwork rather than pursuit. He was of the pleasant, pipe-smoking variety, well-pressed, firm in tone, and inclined to see nature as the chief culprit in all misfortunes not accompanied by bloodstains. He paid a courtesy visit to Mrs. Grenfell, whom he found composed and offering polite regrets over the death of her recent visitor. "I scarcely knew him," she said softly, which was true in form, if not perhaps in substance. Miss Marple, present by vague invitation and accepted village custom, asked no questions, but listened attentively. Inspector Cray answered only what he was asked, and in a tone that suggested the business was regrettable, but closed. "These wandering legal fellows often overexert themselves," he remarked, "and a slippery path can betray even the steadiest foot." She agreed that it could. When she gently mentioned the peculiar placement of the walking stick, the inspector smiled with patronly indulgence. "Yes, but you see, he may have stumbled backwards. It does happen, especially to men who are unused to uneven country ground." Miss Marple nodded once more, though her agreement was not inwardly sealed. There was something too complete, too swift, in the inspector's conclusions. She had learned that accidents which leave no real disorder often conceal something more precise than mischance. And when crimes are quiet, it is not the noise they make, but the silences they leave behind that must be most carefully listened to. It was during her Thursday knitting circle, held this week at the home of Miss Lavinia Hedgecraft, whose Madeira cake was as dependable as her moral judgments, that Miss Marple received the tidbit which gave shape to her quiet suspicions. Miss Hedgecraft, who kept up correspondence with an old friend now employed in the city archives of Bath, had received a postcard not 3 days prior, informing her, quite without emphasis, that a gentleman from London, or perhaps Bristol, had visited the Dulcote Studio collection, asking after photographic sittings from the year 1938. Miss Marple, whose needles moved with a meditative steadiness, paused for only a moment before inquiring quite mildly whether the man had left a name. "Channing," came the reply, "though, of course, that may have been professional, not personal." There had been no rudeness in the gentleman's manner, according to the note, only a certain persistence, a desire for discretion, and a particular interest in the logbook from late summer of that year. Miss Marple said nothing more, but the cake went untouched upon her plate. The Dulcote Studio, so recently discovered stamped on the back of Mrs. Grenfell's mysterious photograph, was no ordinary photographer's establishment. It had catered to discreet family arrangements, the sort involving illegitimate children, hastily arranged sittings, and faces not meant for display. Whatever Mr. Channing had hoped to confirm, it was clear he had come perilously close, and Miss Marple began to suspect that knowledge, in this case, had cost him rather more than answers. It was a remark almost too small to be noticed, and yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to the secondary music of village life, heard it with perfect clarity. The vicar's wife, in the course of an unhurried conversation regarding pension matters, mentioned that Mrs. Grenfell had once worked in Bath, as a governess, I believe, to a rather serious family. Very hush-hush. Something about the child's parentage being delicate. The comment was not malicious, merely incidental, for the vicar's wife prided herself on remembering occupations with great precision. It was the first Miss Marple had heard of such employment, for Mrs. Grenfell had always presented herself as a former secretary, first to a solicitor, then to her husband, before she became his wife. The timeline aligned with what Miss Marple already suspected, that Mrs. Grenfell had spent time in Bath during the late 1930s, in a position that involved close proximity to a child of ambiguous status. That she had never mentioned such work now took on weight, for governesses were entrusted not merely with learning, but with secrets, especially in households where social shame required the smooth veneer of privacy. Was it possible that Mrs. Grenfell had known Harold Thursdale, or, more than known, had protected him, raised him in anonymity? Such connections, Miss Marple had long understood, seldom faded with time. They were simply sealed away, like old letters in an attic trunk, until something, or someone, forced the lock again. It was not Miss Marple who entered the attic, nor did she press for it, but fate, which often assists where discretion forbids, intervened in the form of Ellen, the niece, whose brisk manner masked a curious energy. During a fit of organization, encouraged by an impending visit from a distant cousin, Ellen happened upon an old tin box, wedged behind several disused hat boxes. Her intention had been to dispose of the contents. "Old rubbish," she had called it, until Miss Marple, hearing of it in passing, expressed an interest in the drawings Ellen had briefly mentioned. The box was not large, but it was carefully packed. Folded sketches, crude but tender, of a boy in a sailor suit, riding a hobby horse, or standing beside a tall woman in a hat. Each was initialed H.T., and alongside them lay several short notes, childish, affectionate, ungrammatical. There was no surname, only 2 milligrams from H. Most damning, however, was a torn page from an old estate ledger, partially scorched along one edge, bearing the words, "Trust held in name of J.M. to be reviewed upon reaching age 30. Miss Marple studied it all with quiet care. H.T., Harold Thursdale. J.M., James Milton. A new name, perhaps, but linked to the old by blood and secrecy. Whatever had once been forgotten in this attic had begun to breathe again, and Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on the fragile paper in her gloved hand, felt the pattern beneath the dust growing ever more legible. It had been many years since Miss Marple last passed through the elegant terraces of Bath, but memory clings easily to places touched by secrets. She had arranged, by way of an old acquaintance at the parish guild, a quiet visit to Mrs. Prudence Allott, a retired midwife of impeccable reputation, now residing in modest lodgings near Camden Crescent. Age had refined her to a hushed dignity, and her voice, when speaking of old cases, held the rhythm of one long practiced in discretion. When asked about the Thursdale estate, Mrs. Allott's gaze lingered on a distant window-pane for several seconds before she answered. "Yes, I was summoned there," she said softly. Spring of 37. The daughter, Estelle, was kept mostly to her room. There was no fanfare, of course. Miss Marple nodded. That there had been no public record was not surprising. Births that posed a danger to inheritance or name were often treated like illnesses, whispered about, treated swiftly, and then denied altogether. "Did the child live?" she asked. Mrs. Allott smiled faintly and said only, "He cried. Strong lungs, too. But the carriage took him before sunset." The past, it seemed, had not forgotten to speak, only waited for the proper listener. Mrs. Allott's recollections grew clearer with each word. There had been no birth certificate issued at the time. A temporary arrangement, she explained, pending a decision by the family. The child, a boy, was named James at the insistence of the young mother, though no surname was recorded. He was taken that same evening, the midwife continued, by a man with a northern accent, hired, no doubt, by the family solicitor. I was told not to speak of it, of course. Miss Marple noted the detail with care. A name like James, when chosen under duress, often bore some personal resonance. As for the surname Milton, if that indeed was what he had taken later, it may have come from nowhere, or everywhere. Such children were often assigned innocuous identities for the sake of survival. But the key was in the speed of the removal. No nursing, no photographs, no public acknowledgments. The boy had been born, but not meant to exist. His life sealed off before it could begin. And the mother? Miss Marple asked. She left for the continent, said Mrs. Allott. A sanitarium, I believe. She never came back. And thus, the boy who had once cried in a governess's arms had vanished into the murk of private shame. In the wake of her visit to Bath, Miss Marple employed her usual method of inquiry, gentle suggestion placed in willing ears. Within 3 days, she had the name Lydia Kemp written in small cursive upon the corner of her shopping list, passed along from a former parish worker now living near Weston. Lydia Kemp had once served at the Thursdale estate, a nursery maid of good standing, until, quite suddenly, she was dismissed without reference. No reason had been given. Such occurrences were often explained away as unsuitability, a vague term covering all manner of social transgressions, from gossip overheard to secrets glimpsed. Further inquiries revealed that Miss Kemp had lodged for a time with an aunt in Truro, and later entered domestic service again, though her placements became increasingly brief. It was unlikely she had ever been the source of scandal herself. Far more likely, she had seen something, perhaps too much, and had been removed as part of the wider concealment. Miss Marple, who knew how often women were punished for knowing what others refused to admit, made a small note in her pocket diary. The child had vanished, the mother exiled, and now the nursemaid erased. And yet, threads remained, however faint. Miss Marple's return to St. Alhelm's Lane was marked by a growing certainty, not of fact, but of pattern. That evening, with the polite excuse of returning a borrowed volume on Queen Mary's needlework, she visited Mrs. Grenfell once more. It was not the widow she wished to speak with, however, but her maid, a thin, quiet girl of perhaps 20, with eyes that rarely met one's gaze. In the scullery, over a cup of weak tea and the pretext of inquiring after starching methods, Miss Marple posed her question gently. Had the mistress ever spoken of someone called Jamie? The girl blinked once, startled, then nodded faintly. Not to me direct, she whispered, but I've heard her say the name in her sleep, once, and again, when she was reading one of them letters out loud, the ones in the old tin box. Miss Marple made no remark, only stirred her tea. The name was confirmation. Jamie. James. A child remembered in secret, spoken of in the still hours, when the house gave no judgment. If Mrs. Grenfell had known the boy, had perhaps sheltered or comforted him, then the photograph was no accident. It was memory, positioned on a mantel, as if awaiting a return. It took but a few questions, posed with Miss Marple's particular art, to unearth recollections that had lain undisturbed for over a decade. Mrs. Ferndale, who once kept the post office, recalled seeing a boy arrive by coach one summer, dark-haired, solemn, clutching a small leather case, far too worn for a weekend visit. He came and went, she said vaguely, but I remember him. Didn't smile much. Stayed at the Grenfells, I think. Others remembered snatches. A gardener's boy thought he had seen a youth feeding the ducks at the lower pond, but he didn't say much, and he weren't from around here. A girl who now worked in the draper's recalled a young lad with unusually good manners, who called Mrs. Grenfell ma'am, not auntie. He had not stayed long, a few weeks, perhaps less. No introductions had been made, no invitations extended, and yet his presence lingered faintly in village memory, like perfume, clinging to curtains long after its wearer had gone. Miss Marple gathered each detail and turned it over in her mind. The boy had returned, quietly, briefly, and then vanished once more, but not without purpose. His reappearance had stirred something, and someone had ensured he would not return again. It was the gardener, old Mr. Combs, who attended the Grenfell garden since the colonel's father wore a bowler, that offered the final piece, though quite by accident. In conversation about weathered rosewood and failing root systems, he mentioned the sundial. Funny thing, he said. Found a bit of hollowing underneath the pedestal a few weeks back. Thought it might be soil rot. Turned out there was a little cavity, neatly bricked. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but she encouraged him to continue. Inside, he'd found a small tin box, quite old, sealed with twine. He hadn't opened it, didn't seem right, and had taken it to Mrs. Grenfell, who accepted it without remark and said nothing more. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Did she seem surprised? Mr. Combs scratched his head. Not surprised, more prepared. The sundial, she thought. A fitting place, fixed in time, casting shadows across the garden, but also marking the hours of waiting. Someone had hidden something there not merely to bury it, but to wait for its return. The box, the boy, the memory, all connected. And somewhere among them lay the truth, not yet spoken aloud, but close enough now that silence could no longer hold it. The box, when finally brought to Miss Marple's attention by the hesitant Mr. Combs, had lost none of its quiet solemnity. Its tin surface bore the soft corrosion of time, but the twine about it was firm, tied with the kind of precision that suggests both haste and care. There was no lock, only discretion. Miss Marple, having obtained Mrs. Grenfell's permission, given with an almost imperceptible nod, opened it with hands both firm and gentle. The contents had clearly been placed in sequence: a folded birth certificate, faded with age, a child's drawing, rendered in blue wax crayon, and a final sheath of papers bound in a thin ribbon embossed with the crest of the Thursdale estate. The birth certificate confirmed what had, until now, only been traced in whispers. The child, James Edward, no surname, had been born to Estelle Thursdale on the 14th of May, 1937. No father was named. The drawing, though crude, was unmistakable: a woman in a wide-brimmed hat standing beside a boy in a sailor suit. But it was the final document, written in a hand both elegant and uncertain, that drew Miss Marple's attention with a deeper stillness. A will unsigned, dated shortly before Estelle's departure for Switzerland. The child's name appeared once more. The box had not been meant to vanish. It had been placed carefully beneath the sundial, as one might leave a token, not for hiding, but for return. And return, it seemed, had already happened. Quietly, too quietly. Miss Marple read the document twice before speaking. Though unsigned, its phrasing was unmistakably legal, written, one might surmise, in the confident hand of a solicitor, but dictated by a mother who wished, within her limited power, to make some small amends. The intended beneficiary was listed as James Milton, a name which, if chosen deliberately, bore no trace of the family line that had abandoned him. The will directed that a sum, modest but not negligible, be held in trust until James reached the age of 30, at which time it shall be dispersed to him in full, to be used as he sees fit in life or profession. There was no mention of guardians, trustees, or stipulations of conduct, only a single statement: he was not to be forgotten. Miss Marple noted the phrasing with quiet reverence. It was not the language of law, but of regret, and the date, when matched against the known birth certificate, placed James's 30th birthday within the past year. He had returned, not out of curiosity, nor malice, but to reclaim a piece of himself, not a fortune. He could have no knowledge of that, but the right to exist, as more than a shadow in another's attic. The will had waited beneath the sundial for years. James, it seemed, had come to claim it, and someone still living, had made certain that he never would. The final confirmation came not from handwriting or photograph, but from the simplest deduction, one rooted in timing, silence, and a familiarity too restrained to be false. Mr. Edwin Channing had claimed to be acting on behalf of others, but had asked no questions beyond the ones that might conceal a personal stake. He had flinched, not at names, but at faces, and though he offered no history of himself, he knew the sundial had lingered before the photograph. Miss Marple considered the register at the Dulcote studio, requested by Channing, though his surname appeared nowhere in the birth record. She reflected, too, on the behavior of a man who had arrived without fanfare, wandered lanes known only to those who had once called them home, and who left no trace of correspondence or family. His interest had not been professional. It had been entirely personal. James Milton, born without a name, had returned bearing a borrowed one. Perhaps he believed no one would recognize him. Perhaps he hoped someone would. But now he was gone, found beside a hedger, with only a briefcase and silence for company. And what he had come to reclaim lay unsigned, unfulfilled, and dangerously unfinished. There had always been a peculiar hesitancy in the way Mrs. Grenfell spoke of the past, not a lie, precisely, but the careful omission of truths deemed too painful or too private to be aired. It was a habit Miss Marple recognized among women who had once lived by rules that demanded dignity above confession. The drawing in the box revealed a detail unmistakable to the trained eye. The figure of the woman wore the distinct oval brooch that still adorned Mrs. Grenfell's Sunday blouse, and the boy's eyes, though childishly rendered, bore the same steady gaze as the portrait that had briefly sat upon her mantel. She had been his governess, perhaps more, one entrusted with silence, shelter, and the delicate task of raising a child who could never be named aloud. What passed between them in those early years could only be imagined, but something had endured, enough for her to keep the drawings, enough for her to place the photograph in view, even fleetingly, and perhaps, though she had denied him openly, she had hoped he might find her again. Miss Marple did not judge her. She had known too many women broken by truths they were never allowed to voice. As Miss Marple handled the sheath of papers once more, she noticed a curious thing. Though bound with ribbon, the final folio bore the impression of a second sheet, now absent. The indentation was clear beneath the light. One line, truncated mid-sentence. A wax seal never applied. The second page of the will had vanished. This was not the result of decay or misplacement. It had been deliberately removed. Miss Marple turned over the implications with deliberate calm. Without the final page, the will could not be executed. Its legal force, already tenuous without a signature, would now be void, and the name James Milton, though present, would remain a fiction without confirmation. Who would benefit from such a removal? Not Mrs. Grenfell, whose connection to the estate had long since been severed. Not James himself, but someone with knowledge of the box, someone who had reason to fear the claim. Perhaps one who believed that inheritance, even a modest one, might upend expectations. Someone in the house. Miss Marple considered the household anew, and one name rose quietly above the others, not through guilt proven, but through motive long buried. Ellen, the girl who stood to gain all and lose everything. It began with a murmured comment from the grocer's daughter, passed along to the baker's wife, and finally relayed almost incidentally to Miss Marple over a spool of cotton at the haberdashery. Ellen Grenfell had been overheard in the garden 2 nights prior, her voice raised, not in grief, but in fury. The second voice had been Channing's, low and clipped. The topic, it was said, concerned money, or property, or something he claimed was his. Since then, Ellen had grown unusually abrupt, declining invitations, refusing deliveries at the door, and retreating quickly when the photograph was mentioned. Her defensiveness was brittle, not composed. Miss Marple, who had never trusted emotionless denials, began to measure Ellen's silences more closely than her speech. It was not yet accusation, but the shadow, once cast, rarely lifts on its own, and shadows, in Miss Marple's experience, tended always to fall where secrets had been scorched. The final glimpse came from the charwoman's niece, 16 and sharp-eyed, who had taken the long path to the back garden one windy afternoon to retrieve a forgotten pail. Behind the shed, shielded from view, but not from scent, Ellen stood over a metal basin. Flames licked quietly beneath torn paper. Her hand shook as she pressed something down with the poker, a gesture not of ceremony, but urgency. When the girl asked what she was doing, Ellen turned too quickly, too pale, and muttered something about old bills and unnecessary things. But the girl had seen more. A corner of thick paper with a faded crest, edges browned, ink smudged, but intact. Miss Marple received the report without surprise. Fire was the tool of panic, not forethought, and as the smoke dispersed across the rose beds, a truth buried once more in ash, Miss Marple folded her hands gently and prepared herself for the quietest of revelations. It was not often that Miss Marple requested a gathering. Her habits leaned towards the unobtrusive, the quietly insinuated conversation. The word dropped like a stitch into the right ear. But there are moments, rare, delicate, and quite necessary, when truth, like an antique mirror, must be held up before all assembled. Thus it was that on a subdued Wednesday afternoon, with the shutters half closed against a rising breeze, Mrs. Grenfell's drawing-room received more company than it had seen in many months. The vicar and his wife sat with folded hands. Inspector Cray, summoned with polite insistence, stood with arms politely crossed. Ellen, composed but pale, took her place nearest the hearth, where the photograph had once stood. Mrs. Grenfell herself sat a little apart, the color drawn from her cheeks, but her gaze unwavering. Miss Marple, modest as ever, declined the offered seat, and stood near the writing bureau. There was no theatricality, no raised voice. It was the stillness that lent weight to the moment, the kind of charged quiet one associates with funerals or long unread letters. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently and then, in the voice of a woman who has spent a lifetime listening, began. "I believe we owe young Mr. Channing more than the silence we have thus far granted him," she said, her words measured and without reproach. For silence, though civilized, is not always innocent. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the windows. Inside, no one moved. The drawing room had become not a place of conversation, but of revelation, and those present knew, though none said it, that a reckoning had finally entered with the tea. Miss Marple did not accuse in the manner of men. No stern declarations, no pointed fingers. Her voice, when it came, bore the same softness with which she might remark on a dropped stitch or a bird's nest disturbed in spring. But those who knew her understood that the gentlest of tones could deliver the sharpest of conclusions. She began not with names, but with patterns. Mr. Channing, who visited us under that name, did not come to inquire on behalf of a client. He came for himself. His manner, though precise, bore the inward gaze of someone searching for home, not information. Her eyes passed lightly across the room. The photograph that briefly adorned the mantelpiece was not displayed for our benefit, but for his. It was a quiet summons. She paused, then added more softly, "He was born in secret, like many children of unfortunate consequence. But someone remembered him, not with words, but with drawings, letters, and a tin box buried beneath the sundial." A faint stir passed through the guests. Ellen's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Miss Marple went on. "The box held a will, unsigned but clear, naming James Milton, a trust, a birthright, modest but binding. And then, more softly still, it also held a final page, one that has since vanished, without which the will has no legal weight." She let the statement linger. "It vanished," she concluded, "after someone in this house learned that their own inheritance might be jeopardized, not by a stranger, but by a rightful heir." Her hands folded, calm and still. "And I believe that someone knew the boy's name, not because they were told it, but because they remembered it, as only someone with something to lose ever truly remembers." Ellen did not rise, nor speak, nor protest, but her silence, once a shield, had become a shadow too thick to conceal her shape. Miss Marple, with no unkindness, turned towards her. "You were the first to handle the tin box when it was found, were you not?" Ellen's gaze flickered, but she offered no reply. "The fire behind the shed," Miss Marple continued, "was seen by more than one pair of eyes. It produced very little ash for something so prolonged, but enough to confirm that legal parchment had been among the burned." The room held its breath. "You had no reason to fear Mr. Channing," she said gently, "unless you understood what he came to claim." Still no denial. Miss Marple continued with calm finality. "You saw the name James Milton. You pieced together what others might not, his identity, the trust, and the implications for your own standing." She allowed the words to settle. "And when he confronted you, likely to ask for guidance, you gave none, only anger. And then that same night, he died upon a path he knew too well to stumble upon." A faint sound, something between a sigh and a whisper, escaped from Ellen. "It need not have been murder by intent," Miss Marple added, her voice low. "Perhaps you argued. Perhaps he turned too quickly. But once it had happened, you made a choice. To remove the page. To burn the proof. To let the accident remain an accident." Ellen's face, drained of color, turned inward. The drawing room was quiet once more. But in that quiet, the truth had finally been spoken, not for punishment, nor vengeance, but to restore a name, however briefly, to the place from which it had been erased. The room remained hushed, the air heavy, not with outrage, but with dawning clarity. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver as she moved gently to the matter of Channing's death. It was never a fall of frailty. she said. Mr. Channing was cautious in his movement. He carried a stick, not out of pride, but need and habit, placing that stick firmly in the right hand, not the left. A few eyes flicked towards Inspector Cray, who said nothing. There were no scuffs on the bank, no twisted hem of coat, no flailing limb to suggest surprise. He was found precisely placed, his stick lying to the wrong side. Miss Marple's tone was not accusatory. It was simply descriptive, as though recounting a familiar piece of knitting. He did not fall. He was made to fall. She paused. I believe Ellen asked him to walk with her, perhaps to talk, to appeal to his decency, or persuade him to delay the claim. But something in that meeting turned. Perhaps he refused. Perhaps he offered to return with a solicitor. Whatever passed between them, it frightened her. Her voice softened further, and fear, when mingled with resentment, may lead to desperation. A shove, not a brutal one, just enough to unbalance. No one spoke. The implication, though unsaid, was clear. There had been no premeditated murder, only the sudden calculation of a woman whose security, for the first time in her life, had begun to crack. Ellen did not plan his death, Miss Marple concluded. But once it occurred, she planned its forgetting, and in the silence that followed, it was understood that forgetting had been the gravest offense of all. Mrs. Grenfell had remained still throughout, her expression composed to the point of fragility. Now, as Miss Marple turned to her with unmistakable gentleness, something in the widow's bearing shifted, like frost giving underfoot. You knew, Miss Marple said quietly. Perhaps not from the beginning, but soon enough. When he came to visit, you recognized him, in the mannerisms, the eyes, the tone. Mrs. Grenfell did not deny it. Her hands, which had been folded neatly on her lap, now trembled slightly as she touched the edge of her handkerchief. I was his governess, she said, her voice thin with the weight of memory. I saw him into the carriage. I wrote to the matron twice, but no reply ever came. When he arrived here last year, I knew. Not at once, but after he looked at the sundial, said it hadn't changed. Miss Marple nodded. He remembered the garden. You had shown him kindness. Mrs. Grenfell's eyes clouded. But I didn't protect him. Not really. I was young, unmarried, afraid of losing my place. I told myself it was better to let the family decide. I did nothing. Her breath faltered. When he came back, I should have stood by him, told Ellen, told the police, but I couldn't. I buried it again, like everything else. Miss Marple spoke without judgment. Silence, Mrs. Grenfell, is sometimes born not of cruelty, but of grief. But grief, too, must answer eventually. The widow lowered her head, not in disgrace, but in long-delayed recognition of the truth she had held in her chest for 30 years. It was not the fire, nor the missing page, nor the trembling hands behind the shed that had first alerted Miss Marple to Ellen's involvement. It was a single word, casually uttered, carelessly placed, spoken days before, when the photograph had still rested on the mantel. Jamie, Ellen had said. Not the boy. Not that child. But Jamie. Miss Marple had taken note, not of the slip itself, but of the familiarity behind it. No one had referred to him by name, not publicly, not even Mrs. Grenfell, and the name James Milton had not appeared on any local record, only in the torn ledger page and later in the will, neither of which Ellen was supposed to have read. It was a small detail, but Miss Marple had long believed the smallest details carried the greatest weight. Ellen had spoken of Jamie as if she had known him, not abstractly, but personally, and in retrospect it became clear. Ellen had not merely recognized James, she had encountered him, perhaps even questioned him, and in her alarm, she had sought to contain him. That familiarity was not guilt alone. It was knowledge, knowledge she could not have acquired without contact. In Miss Marple's world, where most crimes begin with a word unmeant, Jamie had been the crack in Ellen's facade, and the key to it all. It was not Miss Marple who asked Ellen to speak, nor the inspector, whose notepad had remained untouched throughout. The silence itself became the summons, pressing upon Ellen until words once hoarded spilled forth. I didn't mean for him to die, she said, the first syllables brittle as frost. He frightened me. Said he was here to claim something, his name, His rights? I thought he meant the house, the land. I thought he'd take everything. She paused, her hands clenched in her lap. I followed him, asked him to leave. He refused, said he had every right. That Aunt Margaret had called him back. He even showed me the letter, hers, written years ago. She looked up, eyes rimmed red. I pushed him, not hard. I only meant to stop him walking away. He lost his footing. Mrs. Grenfell made a sound, a soft, strangled breath, and turned from the room. Her shoulders shook with the weight of 2 decades of silence, and one final betrayal. I took the will, Ellen continued, burned the second page, hid the rest. I thought it would end there. Miss Marple, her voice gentle, merely said, "Truth has a way of surviving." And so it had, passed through fire, grief, and denial, until at last, in the quietest of parlors, it had spoken aloud, not for revenge, but for James. The sundial, long regarded as a mere ornament in the Grenfell garden, had taken on a new weight in recent weeks. Where once it cast idle shadows on trimmed grass, it now stood as a quiet sentinel over something far deeper than time. It was there, in the soft hush of late afternoon, that Mrs. Grenfell stooped to press 3 white lilac bulbs into the earth. There was no audience, no eulogy, only the press of soil against her palms, and the tremor in her breath as she placed the spade beside her knee. Lilacs had always been James's favorite, or so she told herself. It may not have been true, but it felt true, and that, in matters of grief and remembrance, was often enough. No plaque marked the space. No stone bore his name, but the sundial would turn above him, and the flowers, if they bloomed, would offer a kind of absolution. As she stood, knees stiff, she touched the pedestal lightly with her fingertips. It had not been her choice to forget, only her burden to live with the forgetting. Now, at least, he would have a season, something rooted. Behind her, the wind stirred the garden's edge. Mrs. Grenfell turned once more, not with resolution, but with a weary grace. The past could not be altered, but it could, at last, be honored. And that, in its own way, was justice. In the quiet drawing-room of the vicarage, where afternoon light fell across embroidered runners and long-cooled teacups, Miss Marple sat opposite Mrs. Anstruther and poured the second pot without remark. They had spoken little, for the events of the past fortnight had left words somewhat overdrawn, but silence, like soil, often produced more understanding than speech. Miss Marple, turning her teaspoon once more, observed gently that time had a habit of smoothing surfaces, but rarely mending what lay beneath. "We like to say that wounds heal," she murmured, "but often they do not. They simply close and harden." The vicar's wife, who had once borne grief of her own, nodded with a kind of shared comprehension. "Some things must simply be carried," she said, "like winter coats after the weather turns." They both smiled at that, not out of mirth, but recognition. Miss Marple returned her cup to the saucer with care, and yet she added, "Sometimes it takes the return of what we buried to remind us it was never truly gone." They said little else. Outside, the wind bent gently through the sycamores, and a bird called once, and then fell silent. Miss Marple rose with her usual unhurried grace. There was no comfort in what had happened, no satisfaction, only the quiet knowledge that something lost had been remembered, and in being remembered, restored, not in form, but in meaning. And that, in her experience, was the closest the world came to healing. The envelope bore the elegant weight of old vellum and a red wax seal, though its contents were gentler than the formal exterior implied. Miss Marple read it once, then again, and finally folded it along the crease with a contemplative expression. The Thursdale solicitors, having been apprised of James Milton's fate by the local constabulary, and through Miss Marple's quiet intervention, had undertaken a full review of the incomplete testament. Though unsigned and legally null, the spirit of the document had left an impression that could not be erased. With no living claimant and no further contestation, the estate's trustees had elected to honor the original intent. A sum, modest by aristocratic standards, but substantial to those in need, would be redirected to the St. Luke's Home for foundlings in Bristol. A plaque would be placed discreetly in the reading room, bearing the name James Milton in gratitude for forgotten children. Miss Marple read the phrase aloud to herself, once only. There would be no portrait, no fanfare, but something of James would live on, in books turned by small fingers, in letters scrawled on lined paper, in quiet evenings where a child might feel, for once, less alone. It was not justice in the grand sense. It did not undo the death, nor retrieve the years lost to shadows, but it was dignity, and for one born without a name, that was no small inheritance. Miss Marple placed the letter in her drawer, beside a sprig of pressed lilac, and closed it, without sound. In the days that followed, St. Alhelm's Lane returned to its accustomed rhythm, the familiar creak of the grocer's shutter, the faint chime from the church bell, the scent of coal smoke curling up from morning grates. The Grenfell household resumed its domestic motions, albeit with a softness that had not been there before. The villagers, true to their nature, spoke little. There were murmurs, of course, gentle conjectures shared over marmalade jars and fence posts. But the scandal, such as it was, never quite ripened. It remained, like so many English truths, tucked politely behind lace curtains, and preserved in glances rather than speech. Ellen no longer lingered in shops. Her presence, once brisk and sure, had taken on the hesitancy of a person learning their place anew. Mrs. Grenfell, though rarely seen, was observed once or twice at the churchyard. No one disturbed her, and yet something had shifted, not in the buildings or hedgerows, but in the air between neighbors. Faces met one another more squarely. Silences lengthened, not in suspicion, but in shared understanding. Miss Marple, sitting once again on the vicarage bench, remarked that the village had a talent for folding sorrow into its corners, iron flat, like linen stored for winter. But she also knew that within those corners, memory lingered. James Milton would not be mentioned, not officially, but his presence, brief, gentle, unclaimed, had left an imprint. And whether spoken or not, those who remembered would carry him quietly, like pressed violets in a book whose pages were rarely turned. The photograph had returned. It stood once more upon Mrs. Grenfell's mantelpiece, no longer prominent, but not hidden either. Its polished walnut frame had dulled slightly, as though time had finally been permitted to rest upon it. The boy's gaze remained unchanged, steady, watchful, faintly inquisitive, and yet now it seemed less out of place, not because the room had altered, but because truth, once spoken aloud, no longer required disguise. Miss Marple stood before it, her hands loosely clasped. It had taken years, and the quiet unraveling of many small things. A glance, a drawing, a name never meant to be known. But the boy had been seen, remembered, and finally mourned. He would have been 38 now, she thought. Perhaps a teacher, perhaps a gardener, or simply a man who remembered the sound of lilacs opening in spring. Miss Marple did not linger long. She had no need of closure, only of honesty. As she turned, her eyes rested once more on the boy's image. One does not need to raise one's voice to see through silence, she murmured, almost as though to him, only to listen where others forget to. Then, quietly, she left the room, and the village breathed on. Some truths lie dormant, like old roots beneath a sundial, forgotten by most, remembered by a few. But as Miss Marple has once again shown us, even the softest voice can unearth what stronger ones fail to notice. This was never just a story about a will or an inheritance, but about memory, shame, and the hidden cost of silence, and perhaps, too, about redemption, the kind that blooms in pale lilacs and endures in the names we choose to restore. Because when James Milton returned, under another name, it was not for revenge, but for belonging. And though his life ended too soon, the truth he carried changed the lives around him, forcing confessions, prompting reckoning, and planting seeds for something gentler to grow. But here's a question for you. If you discovered someone's hidden identity, one that threatened to undo everything you believed, would you protect the secret, or reveal it no matter the cost? Was Mrs. Grenfell right to stay silent for so long? Or did Ellen, in her fear, become something far colder than she intended?